Good evening, and I want to thank you for sharing your time with me tonight. I'm Tammy O'Neill, the organizer coach, and I'm thrilled that we'll be working together tonight. An interesting subject on what is true grit, or as many of us know it by as resiliency or the resiliency factor. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that tonight. And I thought this was an appropriate subject, especially with the holidays coming up. We have in our minds, this picture perfect holiday scene and how the holidays should play out. And sometimes it doesn't always play out like that, does it? So I thought this would be an appropriate time to address this resiliency factor, how we deal with change. So anyway, I just wanted to give you a little intro into that subject, what we'll be discussing tonight. And again, I'm Tammy O'Neill, the organizer coach, and I offer a 20-minute free phone consult. You can go on my website at theorganizercoach.com and click on the scheduling app under Calendly and schedule your time, your date and time, and I will contact you once I receive your information. So what exactly is resiliency, and how do we come about this anyway? So it's interesting. I'm reading several books now, and I normally don't do this at one time, but I found that these books are very similar in content and subject matter. And I always like to highlight, what I'm reading so I can go back and review and again, look at the highlight of the subject matter. And it's interesting. Both of these books are discussing our brain and how it evolves, how we become ingrained in certain habits, in certain motivational styles. But the brain is a wonderful learning. It's a huge organ that we can retrain the brain when we have habits that we want to change, attitudes that we want to change. And so it all starts in our brain. Isn't that interesting? In this one book I'm reading called The Resilience Factor, it's by Dr. Karen Rivich, R-E-V-I-C-H, and Dr. Andrew Shatte, S-H-A-T-T-E. And it talks about finding your resilience factor and what all is involved in knowing what our inner strength is. And I really thought, so many of my clients, I'm working with them on changing attitude, changing beliefs, because the inner part of what we believe eventually comes to the surface, right? And so our value systems become our priorities. And so when our value system gets out of line with our priorities, then it can, could be challenging, whether it is on, whether it's our belief system, whatever has happened in our life to kind of muddy the waters a little bit. But it's interesting in this book, it says in the resilience, because resilience matters. That's the ability, and that's that true grit. Okay. Remember that movie, True Grit? All right. And I think in 2010, there was a movie remake. So there had to be some resiliency in these Western characters in order to survive. And that's what this one book that I'm reading, it's called How Resilience Matters in Our Life. And what's interesting is it shows us that the research that was done by the two authors here, that it's demonstrated that the number one roadblock to resilience, okay, and this is that ability to pick yourself up and to move forward, and whether that is with coaching, whether it's with organizing, whatever obstacle you see. So this is where the resilience piece comes in. And it's interesting because we're all taught some form of resilience. We adapt to this and we learn it at a very early age. And the interesting, even more, I find more interesting is whatever we learned at a young age, whether it was a survival skill or however it helped us. And then maybe later on we found that maybe that's not such a healthy habit to have. We can retrain the brain. And I find that exciting. And that's what I work a lot with my clients on, is retraining the brain and allowing our brain to get past the perfection, okay? Because there really isn't anyone on this living earth that is perfect. So how do we get that? How do we get it into us? How do we develop it? Well, here are the authors of this book. They've done lots of research, and that's, of course, that's how this book came about. But it was interesting. It's saying that the number one roadblock to resilience, it's not genetics, right? It's not that we were born with a dominant gene of some type. It's not a lack of opportunity or wealth. It's not childhood experiences. But the number one principal obstacle to tapping in our inner strength lies with our cognitive abilities. Isn't that wonderful? Our brain, how our brain thinks, how it decides, how it plans and prioritizes. So it's the cognitive style, which the thinking style, okay? And the ways of how we're looking at the world around us. How do we see that lens? And this is so common, very common with many of my clients that I work with. Their perception of their world, all right, was developed at a very young age. And so they developed coping mechanisms. And maybe they weren't the healthiest of coping mechanisms. And that reverted to the hoarding tendencies that they may be dealing with. And so in order to look at the world in a different perspective, we have to look at our cognitive style, and we have to kind of flip it and say, something else is available. Something else can be done with this. And so this was what's interesting. It's saying a different way of looking at the world and interpreting, that's a key word there, events that every one of us develops from childhood. We all have childhood memories, right? And so humans, we're not passive recipients of sensory data from the world around us, and we actively process information. So we want to simplify and organize it in a way that's going to make sense to us. And if we're unable to do that, then it stays in that that lens, that closed lens. And so we don't allow the opportunity of true grit to come in, okay? So when adversity strikes, what do? We go to our frame of reference of what it felt like before, what happened before when I did this. And that's called the mental shortcuts, okay? To figure out causes and implications so that we can quickly make sense of all this information that's coming at us, or, like information overload. And then at other times, those same senses can lead us astray. And so as we navigate through the world, we just assume that we're going to be responding to a direct readout of the world. But that's not the case, is it? One that is very comprehensive and accurate. But come on, how often do we set out with a plan to do something? Maybe we have a to-do list, and then something happens to deviate from that schedule. Then what happens? Okay, we have to look at that. What about the transition time? How can we build that in so we don't get all willy-wompied up and we can bounce back from the transition in the schedule? And so maybe it's bigger than a transition in the schedule. Maybe we've become ill. Okay. And gosh knows, we've all been affected by the COVID-19, that pandemic. We've all been affected by it, whether you've had the illness yourself or not. So I can relate a personal story. Yeah. Last year, just a little bit, a couple of weeks from now, I was in the hospital with COVID on oxygen. I was in the hospital for a week, and that completely blew my schedule, right? And then Jim was home. He had COVID. He was home with COVID. I was in the hospital. So we were unable to help each other through this sickness, this illness. And thankfully, we recovered from it. But that was an adjustment. That was an adverse adjustment to both of our schedules, to both of our health. We had to figure out ways to cope, to get over that, not only the illness, but the almost like the stigma, of having COVID. Oh, don't go around. And then the fear that we experienced, being around people, because we didn't want other people to get sick and we didn't want to become reinfected, right? So we had a little bit of that fear, and we've had to gradually come to terms with, the COVID and the precautions and the sanitation and all of that coming into play. So that's just one of the adverse things that we had to recoup from. And yes, did we experience true grit right away? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I don't know if you've ever been in a hospital bed for a week and you can't have any visitors in, and the nurses are staying their distance. And it was a very isolated experience, one I never, ever hope to experience again. But I'm thankful. And it took adjustment. I had to get my head wrapped around what was going on. Okay. So then you fast forward and it's 2021. And this year, guess what? I'm recouping from foot surgery, right? And in my head, my expectations for healing and recovery were going to be, a couple of weeks. I'd be back in my running shoes, back in my walking routine, my exercise routine. And guess what? Not there yet. So that's been a big adjustment for me. I've had to rely on other people to help me, to pick up things for me. I couldn't even, I'm still not going to the grocery store. I'm scooting around on a little scooter. But what does this have to do with true grit? So to say it's been easy, it's been a breeze getting through the surgery, blah, blah, blah. It hasn't. I'll be very honest with you. It has not been easy, especially when my expectations didn't align with reality. Okay. So what did I do? Well, I had to pull everything. I had to put my goals for this year. I had to put that in perspective. And I had to realign. I had to make adjustments there. And when I had clients that were calling and wanting me personally to come out, we could do it virtually, but I wasn't able to be in person with them. I could send my team, in which I did many times, and I talk with my clients on the phone, or we FaceTime, or we Zoom, which is a great alternative. And so that helps tremendously in understanding, okay, I need to readjust my thinking. And I say this to you because I have, like I said, my clients, in looking at this, if we can open up that brain, that cognitive thinking of the way something has always been done, and open a new door that says, oh, maybe I can try this. Okay. So this is what's exciting about it. In finding out that resilience matters, and it's in our cognitive thinking, we want to know, how do we listen to our thoughts? That's important to know. That's important in developing true grit. Okay. We want to avoid thinking traps, right? I'm guilty of this myself. When I get on a subject or a thought of something and I want to persevere on it, I gotta find a detour, okay? Because maybe that thinking trap, I'm going down a rabbit hole, or it's not productive for me. Okay. So also we got to detect those icebergs. You know what that is? So the icebergs are these deeply held beliefs about how people and the world should operate, who they are and what they want to be. And they're called iceberg beliefs because they often float on the surface of our consciousness. They're in there, right? And we're not even aware of them. And that's why it's called the iceberg belief. Okay. So we want to see how sometimes these beliefs can interfere with our ability to live the kind of life that we truly want and desire. And it also helps us understand that how we can sometimes overreact to seemingly minor issues or have a difficult time making simple decisions. Okay. And this is very common with my clients. The simple decisions, all that decision making, when it's organizing, when I'm coaching, and it's the helping to alleviate as many decisions as possible so my client can succeed. We look at also challenging beliefs, because this is another goodie that can help stifle that developing of true grit. This is it's often our thinking style that can misinterpret the causes of a problem. Then that in turn leads us to pursue the wrong solution, okay, because of our belief system that we thought that was there. And then another component of this is putting a situation in perspective. How important is putting our situation in perspective? And I know I had to do that, recently. I was, even though I was thankful that I had the foot surgery, very thankful, I was upset with myself. I was upset with myself because in my mind, I wasn't healing fast enough, right? And when I mentioned this to the doctor, I said, what's the deal? I thought I'd be up and running around here, within 2-3 weeks. And thankfully, my doctor was great at explaining the educational, the science part of it. And he was very direct in saying, Tammy, this is major trauma to your foot. It's been opened up, saw it off, blah, blah, blah. So you have to give it adequate time to heal. So I thought, okay, I need to chew on this for a little bit, because my perspective was completely out of line with what was realistic. And this is very common in clients that I work with. So we want to look at that and see, how can we change our perspective so we can develop this true grit? Okay. Another component of this is the calming and the focus. Calming and focus. Like, do you ever get overwhelmed by stress, thinking, oh my gosh, is this ever going to end? Right? Do your emotions just come on so quickly and fiercely that sometimes you can't think straight? Well, part of that is learning that calming, that deep breathing, counting to 10, and that focused, the end result. What do I want my mind to capture? And then by doing these things, we can build what truly is that resilience factor, or that true grit, as we like to call it. Think about that, and we'll discuss more of this, because this is a fascinating subject. And again, the book, it's called The Resilience Factor. You can find it on Amazon. That and the other book that I've been reading is called The Yes Brain. The Yes Brain, opening our brains up to different learning methods. Well, thank you so much for joining me tonight. This is Tammy O'Neill, the Organizer Coach, and I will be back with you in a couple of weeks, November 23rd, 6:30 to 7. I'll have a guest speaker, and her name is Shay Banks. She's a social media strategist, and she's got some really great insight as to what's happening in social media. How does it affect us? Okay. How does it affect us personally? How does it affect us professionally? Great things to think about. Okay. So in the meantime, if you would like to, again, check out my website at theorganizercoach.com, and you can go on my website, schedule your free 20-minute consult. Be glad to talk with you. Thank you so much. You'll have a great rest of your evening, and I'll see you in a couple weeks.